My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I had just called my wife to say I'd be home soon. She casually told me she was at her friend Melissa's. But I was parked outside the apartment of the man I suspected, and her car was right in front of me. It was early evening, just dark enough for streetlights to cast their long shadows, but not so late that anyone would think twice about a silver SUV parked across the street from a nondescript complex. I told myself I was here by accident, just passing by. But that was a lie. I had memorized his address weeks ago. I checked it against our GPS history once when I was looking for something completely unrelated. At least, that's what I told myself then. But even back then, a part of me was already on this road. Her voice had been light on the phone, too light. Almost cheerful. Just hanging at Melissa's, she'd said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Melissa, who was conveniently never reachable when I called. Melissa, who had no idea her name was being used to cover up something else. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. The dashboard clock clicked louder than usual. Each minute that passed felt like another drop of acid eroding the foundation of the life I thought I had. I could barely look at her car. The parking decal on the windshield, the small chip in the paint on the back door, every detail was a painful confirmation. This wasn't coincidence. This was confirmation. I didn't know what I expected to happen next. I didn't even know if I wanted to see her walk out of that building or if I just needed to sit there, frozen in that moment between doubt and devastation. The longer I waited, the more real it became. Every passing second made denial less possible. And still, I couldn't move. I felt like I was balancing on the edge of a decision that would split my life in two, before and after. When I first started having doubts, I dismissed them. A missed call here, a canceled dinner there. She'd been distracted, sure. But I figured work stress, maybe family stuff she didn't want to talk about. We all go through rough patches. I told myself that. I repeated it like a mantra. But then came the changes. Little ones, the kind you can't quite pin down until they've piled up. The sudden interest in late-night errands. The way her laughter shifted when she texted, a kind of smile that wasn't meant for me. She started guarding her phone like it held state secrets. Turning it face down on the table, walking out of rooms to take calls that didn't have names on the screen. I saw it all. And I ignored it. Until now. The apartment building was quiet. Third floor, second window from the left. That's what I'd found out. His unit. I'd never met him, not officially. Just a name. A rumor. The kind that sticks in your head even when you try to shake it loose. I kept thinking about how easily she lied. How practiced she sounded. How quickly she'd slipped into that tone. Like she'd done it before. Like she wasn't even scared of being caught. That's what cut deepest, the casualness. The routine of it. I sat there, barely breathing, staring at that door. If it opened and she walked out, if I saw her come out of his place, smiling, adjusting her coat, brushing her hair back the way she does when she wants to look like she wasn't just somewhere she shouldn't have been, I don't know what I would have done. Not yell. Not cry. I think I would have just evaporated. I didn't need to see her with him to know. The truth was already pressing against my ribcage, suffocating me from the inside out. But a part of me still waited. As if maybe somehow this would all turn out to be a mistake. As if the universe owed me that much. The worst part wasn't the lie. It was that for a long time I wanted to believe it. Because the alternative, that she had already crossed that line, meant everything I built with her was resting on a foundation of sand. And I had missed it. Or maybe I had seen it and looked away. But now, parked across from his building, watching her car sit there in the growing dark, the truth was undeniable. She wasn't with Melissa. She was here. And I was staring at her lover's door. Every minute felt like an hour. I sat in that car, unmoving, watching the glow from the third-floor window like it might blink a message to me, a confession in flickers of light. But there was nothing. No movement, no sounds carried by the early spring air. Just silence and that suffocating stillness that only comes when you already know what's coming but your heart refuses to accept it. I kept glancing at my phone, swiping back to her message, just hanging out with Mel. Love you. There was even a heart emoji. Casual. Warm. Safe. She'd send it 10 minutes after I'd called, as if to reinforce the lie with cheerful punctuation. My stomach twisted every time I looked at it. Not because of the words, but because I could hear her voice when I read them, that light, musical lilt she used when she wanted everything to seem okay. But nothing about this was okay. A woman passed on the sidewalk with a small dog in tow. The dog barked once at my car before she tugged it along, not even glancing up at the apartment. Just another Thursday evening in the city. Just another husband sitting in his car trying to hold back the unraveling. Then the front door opened. My heart seized. I leaned forward, breath caught mid-throat. And there she was. Laughing. Not with Melissa. I didn't recognize the man at first, tall, dark coat, casual stance like someone who had nothing to hide. He was close to her, their bodies angled toward one another in that way people do when they're connected by something unspoken and electric. She tossed her hair, the way she always did when she wanted to be seen. Her mouth curved into that open, unguarded smile I hadn't seen in months. She looked radiant, happy, lighter than she had in weeks. And it hit me then that she hadn't just found someone else. She had left me emotionally a long time ago. I was just now catching up to the departure. They walked together to her car. She said something, he laughed, then reached out and touched her wrist lightly. It was quick, but it told me more than I wanted to know. That wasn't a friend. That wasn't Melissa. That was the man she'd chosen to lie for. She never looked toward my car. Why would she? She believed I was miles away, none the wiser. I sat there like a ghost, watching the life I thought I was living play out in front of me, only I wasn't in it. I wasn't even a background character. I was the discarded draft, the man she used to need before she found something else. They stood by her car for a few minutes. I watched her body language. Open, relaxed, even flirtatious. Not the woman who had said love you an hour ago. That version of her lived in text bubbles and memories. Then he leaned in and said something into her ear. She laughed again, not nervously, not awkwardly. She laughed like it was the most natural thing in the world to be here, in front of his building, at night, while telling me she was with someone else entirely. I felt something cold spread across my chest. Not rage. Not even heartbreak. Just that eerie numbness that comes when you run out of explanations. When your mind stops trying to deny what your eyes are forcing you to accept. Eventually, they went back inside. She didn't hesitate. Didn't check her phone. Didn't even glance back at her car. And I was still sitting there, gripping the steering wheel, her message open on my screen. Just hanging out with Mel. Love you. No. She was just hanging on to the illusion. And I was the only one still trying to believe it. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't even aware I'd stopped until I felt the burning in my lungs. From behind the windshield I watched them, two silhouettes beneath the street lamp's golden glow, suspended in a world that wasn't mine. Her hand touched his arm lightly, fingers trailing like she'd done to me once, back when we were still something. Then she leaned in. First a soft kiss on his cheek. Then his lips. No hesitation. No glance over the shoulder. No guilt. She kissed him like I didn't exist. Like the years we had built together were just scaffolding she no longer needed. Like the vows we exchanged were some outdated language she'd unlearned. There was nothing in that moment, no trace of our life, our inside jokes, our quiet Sunday mornings. Just two people entangled in a moment I had no part in. They stood there like they had all the time in the world. My world. And in that moment, she shattered it. Not with a fight. Not with some ugly truth thrown in a fit of anger. But with a gentle kiss. That's what made it worse. The ease of it. The quiet finality of that small, affectionate gesture. As if their closeness wasn't new. As if this wasn't some reckless impulse but a pattern. A routine. She'd done that same thing with me. A kiss on the cheek, a brush of her hand, and then something deeper, slower, more meaningful. I'd memorized the choreography. And now she was performing it with someone else. He said something afterward I couldn't hear, but I could tell by her smile that it made her laugh. Then she tucked her hair behind her ear the way she always did when she was a little flustered but happy. That wasn't the expression of someone trapped in a mistake. That was comfort. Familiarity. They weren't at the start of something. They were in it. I wanted to look away. I told myself to look away. But I didn't. I kept watching, unable to tear myself from the wreckage of what was once my life. Maybe I thought that if I stared long enough, she'd sense me. Feel the heat of my gaze, turn and see what she was doing, who she was doing it to. But she didn't. She had disappeared so fully into that world with him, there was no space left for me. When they turned and walked back inside, I didn't move. I just sat there, numb. The quiet hum of the engine beneath me. The faint buzz of a text notification I didn't bother checking. My phone might as well have been a brick. What could she possibly say now that would mean anything? In the span of seconds, everything shifted. Not because I didn't suspect. I had. But seeing it, witnessing the truth draped in softness and routine, made it real in a way I hadn't prepared for. There was no confrontation. No shouting. No discovery mid-lie. Just a kiss. Simple. Tender. And in that simplicity, the entire illusion of our marriage collapsed. I don't know why I did it. Habit, maybe? Or some twisted instinct to test her one last time, to give her a final opportunity to step away from the lie. But I dialed. My thumb hovered over her name for a beat too long, as if I needed her permission to push it. She answered on the second ring. Hey, babe. Her voice was bright. Effortlessly light. still at Melissa's. You okay? I could see her. I could see her saying it, phone to her ear, that easy smile in place as she stepped back into his apartment. She didn't know I was right there, parked across the street, watching her walk into someone else's world while pretending she was in mine. The calm in her voice made it worse. Not even a pause. Not a tremor. She didn't miss a beat. It was the kind of lie that's been practiced, smoothed over by repetition. And that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the second. She had this down to a rhythm. Yeah, I forced the word out. Just checking in. She chuckled. You're sweet? Everything okay at home? I looked at her silhouette through the second-floor window. She was moving through his place like she belonged there, comfortable, familiar. Not hurried. Not even trying to fake the stress of a chaotic girl's night or the echo of other voices in the background. Just quiet. Controlled. A curated fiction. I should have said something. Asked how Melissa was. Asked her to put her on the phone. Anything to crack the facade. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was too stunned by the ease of it, by how effortless it was for her to look me in the eye, metaphorically, and spin a second lie on top of the first. Maybe some part of me still hoped she'd catch herself. But she didn't. We hung up after a few more lines of mundane conversation. She said she'd be home later. Said they were ordering food. Mel wants Thai again, she said with a laugh. You know her. And then she told me she loved me. I sat there in the dark silence of my car, her voice still echoing in my ear, and realized what hurt most wasn't the cheating. It was the normalcy of her betrayal. How she could juggle both lives with such grace. How I could call her in the middle of it and she could still say, I love you, like it was true. She lied twice. Once to my ears, once to my heart. And I let her. Because I wasn't ready to break the silence just yet. I thought about driving off. More than once, I reached for the gear shift, ready to pull away from the curb and leave it all behind. Her, him, the apartment building that now stood like a monument to everything I didn't know about my own life. I could have gone home. Pretended I hadn't seen anything. Let the night dissolve into silence and let her come back to her house wearing that same practiced smile. I could have let her lie one more time, let her crawl into her bed and pretend she just had a long night with Melissa. I could have protected the illusion. But something in me refused. It wasn't anger. Not then. It was something colder. Heavier. Like an anchor that had dropped inside my chest and rooted me to that spot. I couldn't just drive away because it wasn't over. Not for me. Not yet. I needed to understand why. What changed? What did I miss? Because marriages don't implode in a single kiss. They erode. Quietly. Slowly. I needed to know when she stopped being mine. When her laughter started belonging to someone else. When the woman who once waited up for me at night became the woman who now kissed another man under the orange wash of a street lamp. I sat there asking myself questions that had no answers. Was it me? Had I been too distracted? Too predictable? Did she fall out of love or just fall into something easier, more exciting? I thought back to the months leading up to this. The way she'd pulled away like the tide retreating from the shore. I hadn't noticed at first. Or maybe I had and told myself not to overthink it. She was tired. Work had been stressful. That's what she said. That's what I accepted. Now, parked outside another man's apartment, I saw the truth through a different lens. It hadn't been stress. It had been detachment. Subtle. Strategic. She was preparing herself for the moment I'd catch up. She just didn't know I already had. I stared at the building's entrance, half hoping she'd reappear. Maybe walk back out with regret stitched across her face. Maybe notice my car and freeze. But nothing happened. The door stayed closed. The lights upstairs glowed steady. The world didn't stop spinning just because mine had tilted. I wanted to walk away. God, I wanted to. But I couldn't. Not without answers. Not without facing the wreckage head-on. Because if I walked away now, the questions would haunt every corner of my life. I'd spend years replaying that moment. The kiss, the laughter, the lies, over and over trying to decode it. And I wasn't ready to live with that. Not yet. She walked through the front door 2 hours later, humming softly, the way she always did when she wanted to fill the silence before it asked questions. Her smile was bright, effortless. Melissa says hi, she laughed, tossing her purse onto the bench by the door, shaking off the chill like it was just another average night. Her keys clinked in the dish we kept near the entryway. Same routine. Same choreography, but everything felt unfamiliar now, like watching someone perform a role they no longer believed in. I nodded, forcing a smile. My mouth moved, but nothing real came out. My face, my voice, they belonged to a man playing along. Inside, I was somewhere else. Still parked across the street from that apartment. Still watching her kiss someone who wasn't me. She walked into the kitchen, pulling ingredients from the fridge, chatting away about Melissa's new puppy. Some story about spilled wine and a ruined rug. Her words spilled out so naturally it made me nauseous. There wasn't a hitch. Not a single pause between the story she invented and the meal she prepared. She made her favorite pasta, the one I always oversalted, the one she used to say tasted better just because I made it. I watched her hands move through the motions like muscle memory. The way she stirred the sauce, wiped her hands on the edge of the apron. Her back turned, her voice cheerful. But it was all performance now, and I was seeing the wires. Every word was a lie I now recognized. When she kissed me on the cheek, I didn't flinch. I just let it happen. Not because I forgave her. Not because I wanted to pretend. But because I needed to know how deep it went. How far she'd take the deception when she believed I was still in the dark. And she took it all the way. She talked about the weekend. About maybe seeing a movie. She asked about my day, smiling when I told her it was fine. I watched her eyes carefully, wondering if she'd noticed the difference in me. The flatness in my voice, the way my gaze didn't linger as long. But she didn't. Or maybe she did and didn't care. She wrapped her arms around me as we stood by the stove, her chin resting on my shoulder, like we were still us. Like nothing had shifted. Like she hadn't just come from his arms and walked straight into mine. And I said nothing, because tonight wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about catching her in a lie. She had already told it, so cleanly, so casually, that I knew it wasn't her first. No, tonight was about watching the curtain fall. About letting her paint herself into a corner with every word she didn't know I'd already seen through. I listened as she poured herself a glass of wine and made a joke about Melissa's bad taste in shoes. And all I could think was, you kissed him. And now you're standing in our kitchen talking about shoes. She said too much. And I said nothing. We sat on the couch, the soft glow of the television flickering across the room, casting shadows on the walls that felt far too familiar now. She curled beside me, legs tucked under a blanket. Wine glass resting in her hand like this was just another quiet evening in a marriage that hadn't begun to rot from the inside. I barely heard the show. The dialogue blurred into white noise, background to the louder thoughts crashing around in my head. My eyes drifted to the phone on the coffee table, her phone, lying face up until it buzzed once, lighting the screen. Evan. It was just a name, but it detonated in my mind like a siren. She saw it at the same time I did. Quick as breath, she tilted the phone away, swiping the notification off the screen with a casualness that might have fooled someone else. Work stuff, she muttered, eyes still fixed on the TV. Her tone was light, dismissive, practiced, but Evan didn't work with her. Evan was the man she kissed, and now he was lighting up her screen like he had a place in her life that I never authorized, that she never admitted. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Not from surprise, not anymore. From the weight of confirmation. The name I hadn't known until tonight had a face now. A location, a kiss, and a message, sent while she sat beside me, wrapped in a lie. She took another sip of wine, then leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. Her body warm, familiar, and utterly foreign. I didn't move, couldn't. Her touch felt hollow now, like something she had rehearsed too many times, like a muscle that didn't know how to stop pretending. The TV kept playing. She laughed once, too loudly, at something on the screen, then caught herself and softened it. I glanced at the phone still in her lap, screen now dark. But the name was burned into my mind. Evan. It sounded harmless, clean, like a neighbor or a dentist. But now it was something else entirely. It was a doorway into her other life, into the place where she smiled freely, touched someone else without flinching, and spoke as if I were just a shadow of a life she no longer needed. I sat there, still and silent, her head on my shoulder and her betrayal vibrating against my skin. She had given me everything I needed, not with confessions, but with carelessness, with the kind of slip that only happens when someone thinks you've stopped looking. But I hadn't. I saw the name, and I would never forget it. I waited until the next day. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to see if she'd lie again, if the facade would hold even under the weight of something small. I watched her move through the morning routine like nothing had changed. Coffee mug in hand, hair still damp from the shower, scrolling through her phone with that casual boredom she wore like a second skin. We were in the kitchen. The light was soft, almost warm, but everything about the moment felt cold to me, distant. Out of curiosity, I said lightly, measuring each word like a drop of poison. "What did you and Melissa do yesterday?" She blinked. Just a moment, but I caught it. "Oh, just talked," she said, too quickly. "Caught up. We hadn't hung out in a while." She added a shrug, as if the gesture would lend authenticity. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, she busied herself with rinsing her mug in the sink. "Why?" she asked, without turning around. My heart pounded against my ribs. I leaned on the counter, keeping my voice even. "She told me she was out of town, visiting her sister in Denver." That was true. Melissa had posted about it, a photo from the airport 2 days ago. I'd seen it late last night, after the Evan message, when I couldn't sleep and started piecing things together. My fingers were shaking then, not from rage, but from the quiet dread that comes when even the backup life falls apart. Her hands froze under the stream of water. She didn't turn, didn't answer. For the first time since this began, she didn't have a story ready. That silence, that tiny stretch of nothing, felt louder than anything she could have said. It was a rupture, a split between the version of her I thought I knew and the one who had built an entire world on falsehoods. Finally, she reached for a towel and dried her hands slowly, as if stalling could erase what I just said. Then she turned to me, a weak smile forming. "Oh, I didn't realize she'd left already. Maybe she flew out late." It was a poor patch over a gaping hole. Her voice wavered. Her eyes scanned mine, looking for clues. Had I caught her? Or was I just fishing? But I didn't push further. I didn't need to. She had already told me the truth. Not with her words, but with her hesitation. Her stillness. The sudden scramble behind her eyes. I saw the panic she was trying to bury. The flicker of fear that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as blind as she thought. And in that moment, she knew. She knew something had changed. And so did I. She sat down slowly, like her legs no longer trusted the weight of her own body. The chair creaked beneath her, and for a moment she just stared at her hands, twisting her wedding ring without even realizing it. Her breath trembled in and out of her lungs, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked, thin and broken. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. The words came out like she was admitting to something minor, like she had borrowed a coat and forgotten to return it. But there was no apology in her tone, just exhaustion, and that somehow cut deeper. I didn't speak. Tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but one slipped down her cheek. Normally, I would have reached for her. Even in a fight, I would have closed that distance. But this wasn't a fight. This was a reckoning. I didn't comfort her. "How long?" I asked. My voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even cold. It was quiet. Too quiet. She looked up then, startled by the stillness in me, as if she had been bracing for a storm and instead found the edge of a cliff. "A few months," she whispered. There it was. Plain. Simple. Not a mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A few months. My fingers curled around the edge of the table. Not out of fury that had passed, but to keep myself grounded. Because her answer was a blade I had known was coming. And still it slid deeper than I expected. I nodded once, slowly. The silence that followed was heavier than anything she could have said. Heavier than her confession. Heavier than the timelines unraveling in my head, birthdays, anniversaries, Tuesday evenings I thought she'd been working late. All of it reframed now. I thought she might try to explain more, but she didn't. Maybe she saw that it wouldn't help. Maybe she realized that no justification could soften the truth now hanging between us like thick fog. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking quietly like she didn't deserve to cry aloud. And maybe she didn't. I sat across from her, unmoving. She had broken before I even raised my voice. Because I didn't need to. The damage was already done. She begged. Not all at once. It started in small, hesitant apologies, like someone afraid to speak too loudly in a room they no longer belonged in. Then the words spilled faster, swears and declarations, promises rebuilt from the rubble she had made. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It's over now. I chose you. I never stopped loving you." Each line felt rehearsed. Too polished. Like she'd said them in her head 100 times before I ever confronted her. Like she'd prepared for this moment, expected it, and was hoping the right combination of regret and desperation would somehow rewind the clock. But it was too late. Because the man she thought she was speaking to, the one who would have taken her hand, looked her in the eyes, and searched for a reason to believe again he didn't exist anymore. Not since I watched her kiss Evan. Not since I saw her laugh in his orbit, speak to me from his doorstep, lie with a fluency I couldn't comprehend. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I just stood. Quietly. Walked upstairs and opened the closet. Pulled a duffel bag from the shelf. It still smelled faintly like last summer, from a weekend trip we took to the coast. Back when I thought we were just tired, just busy, just married. I folded clothes without urgency. Grabbed my toothbrush. A few shirts. My running shoes. I didn't take everything. Just enough to walk away without looking like I was trying to make a scene. She followed me upstairs, her voice breaking in the hallway. "Please, don't go. We can fix this." I paused at the top of the stairs, bag slung over my shoulder, and looked at her, really looked. The pleading eyes. The trembling hands. The hair she hadn't had time to fix that morning. And all I could think was, "You didn't cry when you were with him. Why now?" "I don't know who you are," I said. Not loud. Not cruel. Just final. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. And as I stepped into the night, the air cool against my skin, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Honesty. Not hers. Mine. I had stopped pretending. Stopped holding on to a version of us that only existed in memory. She might still be in that house, surrounded by photographs we took together, but I was already gone. Not just out the door. Gone from us. Gone from the man who waited too long to ask the right questions. Gone from the lie she built and the silence I let it grow in. And for the first time since the unraveling began, I wasn't afraid anymore.